Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all to the Nobel Prize 2020 online lecture series conducted by Science Forum, Yuvarajas College. I am Yavanika S from third semester. I'll be moderating the afternoon session. Let us begin the program with the next lecture in physics on the topic Black Holes of General Relativity by Professor G. Srinivasan. I request everyone to mute their audio and video. Before that, I would like to call upon Suman from third semester to give introduction on the speaker, retired Professor G. Srinivasan from Raman Research Institute, Bengaluru. Over to you, Suman.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sumande, third semester student from Department of Molecular Biology. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, who is going to talk to us on black holes of Einstein's general relativity. He is none other than Professor G. Srinivasan, retired professor from Raman Research Institute, Bengaluru. Professor Srinivasan sir received his doctorate from University of Chicago. He was a student of Nobel laureate Subramanian Chandrasekhar. His area of specialization in condensed matter, physics, and astrophysics, fellow Indian Academy of Sciences, former Jawaharlal Nehru Fellow, former president of Indian Astronomical Society, former president of Division of Space in International Astronomical Union. He also worked at IBM Research Laboratory, Zurich, Switzerland, Chalmers University, Gothenburg, Sweden, and also in Cavendish Laboratory, University of Cambridge, England. So yeah, we're all happy to have such a wonderful intellectual with us today. So dear participants, join me in welcoming Professor G. Srinivasan. I welcome you, sir. Thank you, Ananda. Over to you, sir.
Sir, now you can share your slides, sir, or you can start the introduction.
Good afternoon,
Good
and thank
afternoon.
you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.
Today, I'm going to tell you something about the Nobel Prize for Physics 2020. The recipients are Sir Roger Penrose of Oxford University, Reinhard Genzel of the Max Planck Institute in Munich, in Germany, and Andrea Ghez of the University of California in Los Angeles. The Nobel citation says that Sir Roger Penrose was awarded the Nobel Prize for demonstrating in a mathematically rigorous manner that the formation of black holes is a robust prediction of Einstein's theory of relativity. And as for Genzel and Ghez, they were awarded the Nobel Prize for the discovery of a super compact object at the very dynamical center of our galaxy. Our galaxy is one of 2 trillion galaxies in the universe, a million galaxies. If we could go out of our galaxy and look at it, it will look like the galaxy I have shown in the slide. Galaxies are enormous. Each galaxy has about a million stars. And the size of the galaxy is about 100,000 light years across. The sun and the solar system are about 30,000 light years from the center of our Milky Way galaxy. Now, a light year is a very large distance. It is the distance light travels in 1 year. It is 10 to the power 13 kilometers. So we are 30,000 light years from the center of our own galaxy. Many galaxies, like our own, are like the one shown on the picture on the left. They are flattened like a dosa, with a little Italy, if you like, at the center of the dosa, with a little bulge. If we look towards the center of our galaxy, it is like an ant embedded in a dosa, trying to look at the center of the dosa. If you look at the picture on the left, what you see is a black band across the galaxy. And if you look at the picture on the right, what you're looking at is a view towards the center of our own galaxy. In other words, if you point your telescope towards the center of our galaxy, that's what you will see. you notice that there are black patches in both these images. These black patches represent gigantic clouds of dust just like in the streets of Mysore. Now, one of the fundamental properties of dust particles is that they obscure visible light because their sizes are larger than the wavelength of visible light. And as I said, the black bands that you see in these two pictures are gigantic clouds of dust. The stars that you see on the picture on the right in our own galaxy are a few stars just above and below the plane of the galaxy. It is like if the ant looked above the dosa and below the dosa, it will see a few stars here and there. When you look at stars in the sky, even with the largest telescopes in the world, you're really looking at stars which are very close by, just a few hundred light years distance at most. Please remember that the center of our galaxy is 30,000 light years away. Therefore, we cannot hope to see the very center of our galaxy in visible light due to very severe obscuration by gigantic dust clouds. If you could see the stars at the center of our galaxy, they would be extremely faint because they are 30,000 light years away. Therefore, you need gigantic telescopes to be able to see them. Andrea Ghez and her collaborators used the giant telescope known as the Keck telescope on top of the mountain in Hawaii. These are two telescopes with the mirrors of 10 meters in diameter. As for Reinhard Genzel and his collaborators in Munich, they used an even larger telescope, a very large telescope on top of the mountain in Chile, in South America. These consist of 4 telescopes, each with a mirror of 10 meters in diameter, working in unison. If you want to be impressed with how enormous these telescopes are, may I remind you that in the year 1609, Galileo demonstrated his first telescope to the senators in Venice in Italy. And Galileo's telescope had a diameter of just 4 inches. We are now talking of telescopes which are 10 meters in diameter. But it is not enough to have gigantic telescopes, unfortunately. The reason is the following. The sun heats the earth, and the earth in turn heats our atmosphere. If you heat a pot of water in the kitchen, after a while, the water begins to boil and becomes turbulent. The same thing happens to our atmosphere. Our atmosphere is turbulent. And one of the consequences of turbulence is that astronomical images tend to be blurred, like the picture on the left. It is taken of some astronomical body, it doesn't matter what it is, from a ground-based telescope. So the only way you can avoid this blurring due to the turbulence in the atmosphere is by going to outer space and putting a telescope there. And if you could do that, what you see is the image on the right of the same region as in the left. The Hubble Space Telescope, you've all heard of the Hubble Space Telescope, is 2 meters in diameter. It was just possible to launch it using the shuttle. But it is very unrealistic to think of launching a 10-meter telescope in outer space. So what astronomers have done is to use a technique known as adaptive optics. Using this technique, a large amount of blurring caused by the turbulence in the atmosphere can be overcome. Just to convince you, let me show you 2 pictures. What you see are 2 images of the planet Uranus, which is very far away. This is an image of Uranus taken in the infrared. What you see on the left is the image without adaptive optics. You see that it is very blurred. And what you see on the right is the same planet seen with adaptive optics, and you see is very sharp indeed. Let's look at another example. What you're seeing in the left of the bottom panel is the central region of what is known as a globular cluster of stars, which is a family of about 1 million stars bound together by mutual gravity. For various reasons, astronomers would like to study the central regions of it. And if you did that with a ground-based telescope, what you would see is what is shown on the central panel in the bottom. It is all blurred. But if you look at the same region with adaptive optics, what you would see is on the right side of the bottom panel. You see that the individual stars are now beautifully resolved. Genzel and his collaborators and Guess and her collaborators set out to detect the stars at the very center of our galaxy, 30,000 light years away. But how can one hope to see stars at a distance of 30,000 light years away when there is so much obscuration by dust? Well, they did something clever. They didn't look at these stars in the visible light. They looked at these stars in infrared radiation. Remember that infrared radiation has a longer wavelength than red light in the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. It has a wavelength of about 2 to 3 microns. The characteristic size of a dust particle is about 1 micron in size, whereas 1 micron is big enough to block visible light. Infrared radiation can go around these dust particles, and therefore, using infrared radiation, one will be able to see stars which are as far away as the very center of our galaxy. Therefore, using gigantic telescopes to overcome the faintness of the stars and observing the stars in the infrared to see through the dust clouds in our galaxy, Guess and Genzel and their collaborators were able to detect stars orbiting the very center of our galaxy, a remarkable achievement. Now, to measure the positions of stars accurately, you need very high angular resolution. Therefore, you have to beat the blurring due to the turbulence in our atmosphere. This they achieved using adaptive optics that I mentioned to you. Now, what you see on the left is the image of the very center of our galaxy, 30,000 light years away, in the infrared at a wavelength of 2.2 microns. You see the square box, the inset, which is expanded. That is the dynamical center of our galaxy. That's what you want to study. You see that it is completely blurred due to the turbulence in our atmosphere. But by using adaptive optics, you see that Guess and Genzel and their collaborators were able to resolve individual stars at the center of our galaxy, 30,000 light years away. Now, in order to measure positions of the stars, in addition to measuring the positions of the stars at the center of our galaxy, they also tried to measure their velocities and acceleration as they orbit the dynamical center of the galaxy. Please remember that everything in our galaxy has to go around the center of the galaxy, otherwise you will fall into the galaxy, just as the planets in the solar system have to constantly go around the sun, otherwise they will crash into the sun. So they wanted to study the velocities and accelerations of these stars that orbit the very center of our galaxy. Now, how do you measure velocities in astronomy? You measure it using Doppler shifts. You're all familiar with Doppler shift in sound. The siren of an approaching ambulance will appear to you to be of a higher frequency. The siren of a receding ambulance will appear to be at a lower frequency. This phenomena of Doppler shift in frequencies due to the motion of the source or the observer is also true for electromagnetic waves. Therefore, what astronomers do is to identify a particular feature in the spectrum of the source and see how that spectrum changes as the star moves or accelerates. Now, in order to do that, you have to have very high frequency resolution, because imagine that you are looking at the motion of a star which is 30,000 light years away. Therefore, the projected velocity in the sky will be very, very small, and you need very high frequency resolution. In order to achieve this frequency resolution, what they have done is use a technique that is well known in radio receivers. You may remember, some of you may remember, your teachers will remember the days when radios were using amplitude modulation, AM radios. Nowadays, of course, radios use FM or frequency modulation. Imagine that your radio is tuned to BBC in London. Surely you're not receiving sound waves from London, which is thousands and thousands of kilometers away. What you're receiving are radio waves whose amplitude is modulated by the sound waves. And what you're trying to detect is this modulation in the amplitude of these radio waves. How do you detect these modulations? If you look at the slide there, on the second from the top, it is shown that inside your radio, there is a frequency generator which produces a frequency of radio waves, which is very close to what the BBC is broadcasting. Then you mix the two signals. What you get are beat frequencies, some and different frequencies. And those are shown in the third and fourth panel in the slide above. And you see very clearly that in these beat frequencies, you can see the modulation, which is due to the sound, which is superimposed on that. So what people would like to do in order to measure velocities very, very accurately is to use this well-known technique known as heterodyning technique in visible light and infrared radiation, and that is exceedingly difficult to do. But it was achieved by a very well-known physicist known as Charlie Townes. He's no more now. He invented the maser, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize. He was also interested in astronomy. In fact, he was the first person to try to study the central region of our galaxy. And he perfected this technique of heterodyning infrared radiation. Therefore, Genzel and their collaborators and Guess and their collaborators use adaptive optics and the technique of heterodyning developed by Charles Townes to study the motion of stars in the central region of our galaxy. And what you see in the bottom two panels is the result of observations over 21 years. So these are all very hard observations, and you don't do it overnight. These are observations over 21 years combined, and you can see that individual stars have been followed as they orbit the center of our galaxy. What did they find? What did they find that is so exciting that they should be awarded this year's Nobel Prize for Physics? Well, they found that this central object around which the stars are orbiting is extremely compact. Radio astronomers had already suspected that it is a very compact object. Here was an even better confirmation. The second thing they found was that this object was extremely massive. It is 4 million times more massive than our sun. So what? So everything. Because if you have such a large mass as 4 million solar masses in a very small region of space, then according to Einstein's general theory of relativity, it has to be a black hole. Are there many black holes in our universe? Well, answer is yes. But black holes come in different masses. The overwhelming majority of black holes will be of stellar mass. They'll be 10 or 15 times the mass of the sun. And how many are there in our galaxy? According to our estimates, there should be more than 100 million black holes of stellar masses in our own galaxy, in addition to the supermassive black hole of 4 million solar masses at the center of our galaxy. I already told you that there are 2 trillion galaxies in our universe, 2 million galaxies in our universe, each containing about 100 million black holes. The black holes that reside at the center of galaxies are supermassive. The black hole at the center of our galaxy is not very massive. It's only 4 million times the mass of the sun. In majority of galaxies, the black hole that resides at their centers is billions of times the mass of the sun. What are black holes? Why are they considered so exciting objects? Let us go back to the year 1783 to Cambridge in England, soon after Isaac Newton. John Michell was a natural philosopher and a clergyman in the church near Cambridge, was an extraordinary scientist. He used Newton's law of gravity and Newton's ideas on light to make an extraordinary suggestion. He said, imagine a star whose mass is m and whose radius r is equal to 2gm by c squared, where g is Newton's constant of gravity, m is the mass of the star, and c is the speed of light. He argued that such a star will be black because no light will be able to escape from the star. Let us recall the notion of escape velocity. If I throw up a stone perpendicular to the surface of the earth, it will go up, slow down, turn around, and fall back to the earth. I can ask, is it possible for me to throw a stone so that the stone actually reaches infinity? The answer is yes. And what is the velocity with which I have to throw it? It's about 11 kilometers a second. And where did that number come from? Well, the velocity that you need to escape the gravity of the earth can be calculated, as you will see in the formula there, by equating the kinetic energy, which is half mv squared, to the potential energy, which is gmm divided by r. If you solve this for velocity, you find that the velocity of escape is 2gm by r squared under the square root sign. Now look at the expression inside the square root sign. When the radius of the star becomes equal to 2gm by c squared, 2gm cancels out from the numerator and denominator, and what you have is square root of c squared, which is c. Therefore, the escape velocity from the star will be equal to the velocity of light itself. Therefore, if the star was slightly smaller than that, even light cannot escape from the star. A few years later, the great mathematician Laplace, in his very famous book published in 1798, wrote, a luminous star of the same density as the Earth and whose diameter should be 250 times larger than that of the Sun would not, in consequence of its attraction, allow any of its rays to arrive at us. It is therefore possible that the largest luminous bodies in the universe may, through this cause, be invisible. 10 years later, when the second edition of this book was published, he removed this paragraph. What happened in 10 years? During the 10 years, Huygens in Holland and Young in England discovered the phenomena of interference of light. It became clear that light did not consist of particles as Newton had imagined, but light is actually a wave. Laplace didn't know how to deal with waves in the presence of gravity. And that question remained unanswered till 1915, when Einstein published his famous general theory of relativity. Now, the general theory of relativity, which is a theory of gravity and describes the whole universe, is described by a set of equations which is shown in the middle. According to Einstein, physics is nothing but geometry of space and time. Now let's go back to the year 1905 before we return to the general theory of relativity. In 1905, Einstein published his theory of relativity, and it is called the special theory because he said, let there be no gravity, because he didn't know how to deal with gravity in 1905. That's why it's called as a special theory, a particular theory where there is no gravity. This theory made a number of predictions. For example, according to Einstein, a moving clock will tick slower than a stationary clock. A moving rod will appear shorter to a stationary observer. Mass and energy are equivalent. They are convertible. E is equal to mc squared. Let us look at the first prediction. Imagine there are two identical, very accurate clocks. One is on the ground, and the other one you put on top of the bullet train, which is racing past Mount Fuji in Japan. To the stationary observer on the ground, the moving clock on the jet bullet train will appear to tick slower. Faster the train moves, slower the moving clock will tick. Till finally, when the train moves at the speed of light, if it could, then the clock will not tick at all. Time would have come to a standstill. Now, what is the general theory of relativity? According to Einstein, gravity is not a force. Remember, Newton said, the apple falls to the ground because it is attracted by the earth's force of gravity. The moon is attracted to the earth by the force of gravity. The earth is attracted to the sun by the force of gravity. Einstein said, this is not true. All you're observing is that the apple is accelerating towards the ground. All you're observing is that the moon is accelerating around the earth. He said this acceleration is not due to force. This acceleration is due to the curvature of space and time. What he said was that if you had a massive body, then in its vicinity, space and time will be curved, as shown in the picture over there. Imagine that there was no massive body in the universe and space is flat, as in the top picture that you see. This is in the absence of gravity. Now, if you have objects in the flat space-time, then in the absence of an external force, this object will be either at rest or in uniform motion. Remember Newton's first law? Every body will be in a state of rest or in uniform motion unless it is acted upon by an external force. But if you have matter, as you see in the bottom picture, then it warps space, it curves space, and therefore a test particle will either accelerate or decelerate. And it is this acceleration or deceleration that we call as gravity. Therefore, to repeat, according to Einstein, gravity is not a force. It is merely a curvature of space and time. One of the predictions of Einstein's general theory of relativity, that since light has energy, remember from special theory, E is equal to mc squared. Since light has energy, it has an equivalent mass. And therefore, anything with mass will be deflected by gravity, and therefore light will be deflected by gravity, just as a stone will be deflected by gravity. A second important prediction of general theory of relativity is what is known as the gravitational redshift. Imagine I shine a torchlight or a laser beam perpendicular to the surface of the earth. As the light climbs against gravity, its potential energy will increase. Remember, when I throw up a stone, its potential energy increases mgh, where h is the height from the center of the earth, or the surface of the earth. So as the stone goes to greater and greater heights, the potential energy increases. Where does this energy come from? It comes at the expense of its kinetic energy. The stone, as it goes up, slows down and gives up some of its kinetic energy, half mv squared, which goes into the potential energy. Same thing should happen to light as it climbs up in a gravitational potential well. Unfortunately, light cannot slow down. Maxwell told us that the velocity of light is absolute. So how can the energy of light change if it cannot slow down? E is equal to h nu. Max Planck taught us that in 1900. Therefore, the way the energy of light will decrease is by the frequency of light decreasing. Therefore, as the light climbs up a gravitational well, its frequency will decrease, its wavelength will be stretched, and its energy will decrease. This phenomenon is known as gravitational redshift, and it is very important for us when we start discussing black holes in a couple of minutes. A related prediction of general relativity is the following. Rate of ticking of a clock is affected by gravitational potential. I already said that the rate of ticking of a clock is affected by its motion. That is the special theory of relativity. The same thing happens when there is a gravitational potential. Now imagine our identical clocks. One is placed on the ground and the other one is now placed on top of Mount Fuji. Because gravity is stronger on the surface of the earth than on top of Mount Fuji, the clock on the surface of the ground will tick slower than the clock on top of Mount Fuji. Now, all your smartphones have what is known as a GPS receiver, geopositionary positioning system receiver. What you have orbiting the Earth are 10 or 12 satellites, which is part of the GPS system, each of which carries a very precise atomic clock. Identical atomic clocks are there on the ground with which they sync. But remember, even though these clocks are identical, they tick at a different rate. This clock is on the laboratory on the ground. The other clock is some 1,000 kilometers above the surface of the earth. Believe it or not, your GPS receiver on your phone is able to tell you when you move from the back side of your house to the front side of your house. It is able to do that because the clock which is orbiting the earth has to sync with the clock on the ground. And in order to do that, you have to make the correction due to Einstein's general theory of relativity, namely the rate of ticking of these two clocks will be ever so slightly different. Now, the general theory of relativity makes two remarkably new predictions. First, it predicts the existence of gravitational waves. 100 years after their prediction in 1915, 5 years ago, gravitational waves were detected for the first time, and last year's Nobel Prize for Physics was given for this. The second prediction of general relativity is the prediction of black holes. But you'll say, but black holes were already predicted in 1783 by John Mitchell. But there is a fundamental difference. And the difference arises due to the following reason. Einstein published his theory of general relativity, a preliminary version of that theory, in November 1915. Within a couple of months after that, a great mathematician, physicist, and an astronomer by name Karl Schwarzschild of Germany found an exact solution to Einstein's complicated equations of general relativity. Now, Karl Schwarzschild was an officer in the German army. You will remember that in 1916, World War I was raging. Germany was at war with Russia, and Karl Schwarzschild was fighting in the Russian front. There, sitting in the trench, ducking bullets and cannonballs, he derived an exact solution to Einstein's new theory of gravity and sent a postcard to Einstein. Einstein almost fell out of his chair because he never thought anybody would ever be able to find an exact mathematical solution to his complicated set of nonlinear differential equations. Karl Schwarzschild had found that. Unfortunately, within a month, he contracted a disease in the war front and he died. But Einstein had his paper published in the Royal Academy of Germany, Prussia at that time. Now, Schwarzschild's solution describes in a mathematically exact manner the curvature of space and time near a spherically symmetric body, as shown in the picture on the right. The Schwarzschild geometry describes not only the curvature of space, but also the warpage of time. This is just the dilatation of time due to gravity that I explained before. As I said, this also leads to the phenomena of gravitational redshift. Therefore, if light is, if for example, H alpha wavelength of hydrogen is emitted by a star, then the wavelength you receive of this H alpha radiation will be slightly longer and the frequency will be slightly smaller than you would measure in the laboratory. This is fine, but this is already something that I have explained. The point I want to emphasize is that if for some reason the star shrinks and collapses, these effects become more and more and more severe till something very, very dramatic happens. Let us look at Karl Schwarzschild's exact formula for this gravitational redshift. Nu1 is the frequency emitted by an atom or a molecule. Nu2 on the left is the frequency received by an observer outside the star. Nu2 is equal to Nu1 into bracket 1 minus 2 gm by c squared divided by r. I've repeated the formula over there. Now notice that as the star contracts and when the radius reaches 2 gm by c squared, the second term inside the bracket becomes equal to 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. Therefore, Nu2 is 0. Therefore, when the radius of the star reaches the magical value 2 gm by c squared, the frequency of radiation goes to 0, the wavelength goes to infinity, and the energy goes to 0. And therefore, the star will appear black because no radiation is able to escape from the star. Now, in what way is this different from John Mitchell's star? John Mitchell's black star is shown on the left. According to John Mitchell, light particles will not be able to escape to infinity. They will go up and return to the star like a stone falling back. But if I could orbit the star in a very clever way, I could detect these photons jumping up and going down, jumping up and going down. So I can see the star if I'm close enough. But you can never see a general relativistic star of the same radius because even if you are outside it by 1 millimeter, the frequency of radiation you will receive will be 0, wavelength will be infinite, energy will be 0. So a general relativistic black hole is fundamentally different from a Newtonian black hole. Now let us advance the time and go to the year 1939, the year World War II was declared. There, Oppenheimer and a young student of his by name Schneider made a very remarkable discovery. They studied the collapse of a star, a spherically symmetric star, in a mathematically exact manner within the premise of Einstein's general theory of relativity. And this is what they found. As far as an observer looking at the collapse of the star is concerned, this is what the astronomer will see. As the star nears the critical radius, 2 gm by c squared, its shrinkage will slow down and slow down and slow down till its shrinkage will be frozen and you will never see it reaching 2 gm by c squared. But imagine there is a second astronomer on the surface of the star. What will he see? He will see something dramatically different. He will see that as the star collapses, it collapses faster and faster and faster. Just as if you drop a stone, it will go faster and faster and faster. And therefore, there is no freezing at all. So here you have a remarkably different description of the same phenomena as seen by an outside observer and as seen by an observer collapsing with the star. They concluded that paper with the following sentences. When all thermonuclear sources of energy are exhausted, a sufficiently massive star will collapse. The radius of the star approaches asymptotically its gravitational radius, 2 gm by c squared. Light from the surface is progressively reddened, waves are stretched, and can escape over a progressively narrower range of angles. The star thus tends to close itself off from any communication with a distant observer. Only its gravitational field persists. 4 years before this paper was published, Sir Arthur Eddington in Cambridge had already dismissed this notion of black holes. He reacted in response to Chandrasekhar's great discovery of 1930 and 31 as a young boy of 21 years of age. Chandrasekhar's discovery made Eddington realize that if Chandrasekhar was correct, massive stars will collapse to become a black hole. And he didn't like that. And this is what he said. The star has to go on radiating and contracting until, I suppose, it gets down to a few kilometers in radius, when gravity becomes strong enough to hold in the radiation, and the star can at last find peace. Various accidents may intervene to save the star, but I want more protection than that. I think there should be a law of nature to prevent a star from behaving in this absurd manner. In 1939, Einstein published a paper, which was a mathematically rigorous paper, and he concluded that an essential result of this investigation is a clear understanding of why the Schwarzschild singularities do not exist in physical reality. The word black hole was not coined in 1939. They were called Schwarzschild singularities because the redshift became infinite. So Einstein rejected this notion of black holes, even though black holes were predicted in a mathematically rigorous manner by his own theory, as was shown by Karl Schwarzschild. So a black hole of general relativity is an imaginary surface to which a star collapses, whose radius is 2gm by c squared. What are the properties of this surface? This surface of a black hole is known as an event horizon. And what is extraordinary and exciting is that it is a semi-permeable surface. Things can only go into that horizon, nothing can come out of it. Inside the event horizon, if you had gone there, no one is allowed to stay at a constant distance from the center anymore. You have no option but to fall into the very center. The only allowed trajectories inside the black hole are those trajectories all pointing towards the center of the black hole. Now imagine that I shine a flash of light. As you know, the flash of light will expand in all directions with the speed of light, and the wavefront will be a spherical wavefront expanding in radius at the speed of light. In 2 dimensions, what you would see is a circle. As time elapses, the spherical wavefront will expand to larger and larger radius. Please note that the point of emission of the flash of light will always be at the center of the spherical wavefront. Now let's imagine a bunch of people shining flashes of torchlight near a black hole. Remember that light is affected by gravity according to Einstein's general theory of relativity. So here is a picture due to Sir Roger Penrose. Look at the circle on the left. On the right, the red circle, that is the black hole. But look at the circle on the left of your image. A flash of light emitted far away from the black hole expands in a spherical wavefront with the center of emission, the black dot, at the center of the wavefront. But you look at the other 2 flashes, the center of emission is no longer the center of the wavefront. That is because the wavefront is attracted more towards the black hole due to the strong gravity of the black hole. Now, if I were to emit a flash of light having entered the black hole, you see that the wavefront completely detaches itself from the point of emission, and light is then attracted like anything else, everything else is attracted towards the very central point of the black hole, which is a singularity about which we'll turn to presently. Now, why did Oppenheimer and a student find a very different description of the collapse of a star as seen by an astronomer outside and by an astronomer falling with the star? According to general relativity, If I throw a stone towards the black hole, the velocity of the stone as seen by an observer outside is given by this equation over there. Whereas, if a person, look at the picture on the left, if a person was stationary by some magic on the blue circle and he watched the stone go past him, the velocity that he will ascribe to the stone is shown in the formula below in the blue box. Now, these are complicated looking equations. There is an ancient Chinese saying, one picture is worth 10,000 words. So let us look at these two equations graphically. What is shown on the y-axis here is the speed of the stone or the speed of the falling astronomer on the surface of the star. What is shown on the x-axis is the distance from the gravitational radius. Rg is the gravitational radius 2gm by c squared. So to the right in the horizontal axis is far away from the object. As you come to the left, you are approaching the star. You're approaching the gravitational radius. Let us look at the speed of collapse as seen by a faraway observer. He will see the collapse going faster and faster till finally it will slow down and slow down and slow down, and the velocity, you notice, goes to zero at the gravitational radius. In other words, as far as the distant observer is concerned, the star never reaches the surface of a black hole. But as seen by an observer co-riding the star, he will see that the speed of the collapse increases and increases and increases till finally, when he reaches the magical radius of 2gm by c squared, the speed of collapse becomes equal to the velocity of light itself. If you enter a black hole, as I said, you cannot remain stationary anymore. You have to fall to the center. How long will it take you to fall to the center? General relativity gives a very simple expression for it, which is shown over there. But let us get a feel for it. Suppose the sun were to become a black hole. Its radius will be 3 kilometers in size, just as big as Mysore. If you fall into it or throw a test particle into it, it will crash into the center and be crushed out of existence from this universe in a few microseconds. But larger the mass of the black hole, larger is the radius of the black hole, because radius is 2gm by c squared. So if you were to fall into the black hole at the center of our Milky Way galaxy, which is 4 million times the mass of the sun, its radius will be 12 million kilometers, then you have a little time, you have 30 seconds to send a WhatsApp message to your friend saying, I'm falling into the black hole, except your WhatsApp message will never reach your friend because no radiation can escape the event horizon. In 1916, Carl Schwarzschild found an exact solution, exact description of the geometry of space and time surrounding a spherically symmetric star. But real stars are not spherically symmetric. They rotate and therefore they are oblate. They have energy generation inside. There is pressure, there are shock waves. Is there a description of the nature of space and time around a rotating body? After all, the earth is rotating, the sun is rotating. Well, an exact solution of Einstein's equation for the geometry outside of a rotating body was discovered only much later. In 1964, a New Zealand mathematician by name Roy Kerr found an exact solution to Einstein's general theory of relativity for a rotating body. Soon after that, a young student by name Brandon Carter in Cambridge showed in a mathematically rigorous manner that Kerr's solution is not particular to one particular rotating black hole, but it describes in a mathematically exact manner every rotating black hole in the universe. Since non-rotating black holes are a particular case of rotating black hole, the Kerr solution describes in a mathematically exact manner every black hole in the universe. Now, there are some weird properties of a rotating black hole. There are two regions around a rotating black hole. There is the black region, like before, and then there is the red region, which is known as the ergosphere. The red region is not a sphere, it is oblate and it touches the central sphere in the pole. Therefore, let us look at this looking from the North Pole. What you see in the center is a region whose radius is gm by c squared, not 2gm by c squared, but gm by c squared. That has all the properties of a non-rotating black hole. But surrounding that, there is a region which is known as the ergosphere. There are some very remarkable properties of the ergosphere. First of all, the moment you enter the sphere, you have to go around. That is because in general relativity, if an object, a massive body, rotates, it drags space itself with it. If I have a bucket in water, if I rotate the bucket, you know that due to viscosity, the water in the vicinity of the bucket will also go around. Now we are talking of space itself going around. It is being dragged by the rotating body. The second remarkable property of the ergosphere is, if by some reason I fall into the ergosphere, I can come out. I'm allowed to come out. But if I fall into the black region, then like before, you cannot come out. Now, one of the remarkable things about a rotating body, as I said, is that since the space around it is sheared and made to rotate, any test particle or light will also be dragged around the black hole. So even if I emit a flash of torchlight towards the black hole, the torchlight will not go straight, but it will go in a circular orbit. That is shown over there. If I were to throw a stone or a photon radially towards the black hole, in Newtonian mechanics, because there is no angular momentum, I'm throwing it radially, it'll go straight and crash into the star. But in the case of a rotating black hole, when the stone or the photon comes close enough to the black hole, it will be caught by space which is rotating and made to go around, and it will spiral in, and finally it will fall into the black hole. In 1967, Roger Penrose came up with a very clever mechanism of how you can extract energy from a black hole. Now, one of the most remarkable things about the ergosphere, the red region, is that you can have particles existing there whose energy is negative. In the world we live in, real particles, electrons, protons, photons, people like us have to have either zero energy or positive energy. You cannot have negative energy. But inside the ergosphere, you can have particles with negative energy. Now let's do something very clever. Imagine a particle, a blue particle with 10 units of energy enters the ergosphere, and it decides to split into two particles, a green particle and a dashed particle. The green particle has positive energy, 15 units of energy. The dashed particle has negative energy, -5 units. So a particle with 10 units of energy has created two particles, one with +15 and one with -5. The negative energy particle falls into the black hole. The green particle with 15 units of energy comes out. So what you have done is thrown a particle with 10 units of energy, and out comes a particle with 15 units of energy. So you have extracted energy. Where did this energy come from? There is no magic to it. The particle has actually extracted rotational energy of the black hole. This is known as the Penrose process. What is inside the black hole? There is nothing inside the black hole. Because, as I said, according to Einstein's general theory of relativity, once the star collapses to the magical radius of 2gm by c squared, it cannot stop its collapse. It has to collapse and collapse and collapse and collapse till it becomes of zero volume, an infinite energy density. Therefore, there is nothing inside a black hole. Not really. After creating the black hole, the spherical star continues imploding to infinite density and zero volume, whereupon it creates a space-time singularity. Now, what is a singularity? In mathematics, a function is singular at some point if its value goes to infinity. Consider a function 1 divided by z minus z naught. When z is equal to z naught, the denominator goes to 0. 1 divided by 0 is infinity. Therefore, the function is singular at z equal to z naught. Here we are talking about a space-time singularity, a region of space and time with zero volume but infinite energy density. So what is inside a black hole is not nothing but a space-time singularity. But people rejected this idea. In 1935 itself, Eddington had rejected the idea. In 1939, Einstein rejected this idea. John Wheeler, who coined the phrase black hole, said the fact that general relativity predicts a space-time singularity inside the black hole proves that general relativity must break down due to quantum mechanical effects. Now, why didn't people believe this extraordinary discovery by Oppenheimer and a student? They thought that the result of a space-time singularity was an artifact of the artificial assumption they made of a star being perfectly spherically symmetric. Now, if an object is perfectly spherically symmetric, as it collapses, it will certainly meet in the center. But real stars are not perfectly symmetric. A real star could be a cube. It could be like a pyramid. It may have mountains and valleys. It has energy generation inside. There are pressure waves inside, shock waves inside. What is the guarantee that if such a real star that populated our universe collapses, it may form a black hole, but why should it all meet at one point and form a space-time singularity? That is why nobody believed it. Till in 1964, Roger Penrose proved one of the most remarkable theorems in the history of physics. He proved in a mathematically exact manner that if a black hole forms, there must be a singularity inside it. This was perhaps the most profound discovery since the discovery of the theory of relativity itself. Now, why was it so profound? It was profound because of its sweeping power. Roger Penrose did not assume any idealized conditions. He did not assume that if the star had deformations from spherical symmetry, they are small. He did not assume the star does not have a magnetic field, no pressure inside, nothing like that. He said every body, when it collapses, if it forms an event horizon or a black hole, then a singularity must be formed. Therefore, it is now not a conjecture, but a mathematically rigorous statement that what you have inside the black hole is a space-time singularity. What is the guarantee that the singularity is not outside the black hole? It's very bad to have a singularity. Physicists don't like singularities. So Penrose tried for a very long time to construct models where the singularity would be outside. He never succeeded. The singularity was always inside. But it was not a rigorous demonstration. So he stated in 1969 a censorship principle, which is called the cosmic censorship principle. He said, no imploding object can ever form a naked singularity. If a singularity is formed, then it must be clothed by a black hole so that the outside observer cannot see it. Stars have magnetic field. The sun has a magnetic field. If it collapses, will the black hole have a magnetic field? A great man in Moscow said, no, it will not have a magnetic field. Suppose the star was a cube, for the sake of argument. Suppose the star had mountains and valleys on it. Will the black hole be a cube or will it have mountains and valleys on it? The great Russian physicist Zeldovich said, no, black hole will always be spherically symmetric. These conjectures were finally proved in 1972 in an exact mathematical theorem by Brandon Carter, Stephen Hawking, and Werner Israel. They showed that black holes are uniquely characterized by their mass, charge, and angular momentum, and nothing else. So if I had a black hole of a certain mass made up entirely of electrons, another one made entirely of neutrons, another one entirely made up of proton, another one made entirely of Maruti cars, all of the same mass, you cannot tell the difference because a black hole is uniquely characterized by its mass, charge, and angular momentum, and nothing else. What about the mountains and valleys? They're all radiated away as gravitational waves, till finally what you have is a spherically symmetric black hole. But come on, there are electrons, neutrons, and protons in a star. So if a star collapses, there are particles. These particles have attributes. They are baryon numbers, lepton numbers, they have spin angular momentum, they have isotopic spin, the strangeness quantum number. These were all conserved in our world. For every discovery of every one of these conservation laws, a Nobel Prize was given in the last 50 years. But a black hole doesn't care about these things. Does a black hole violate all the laws of quantum mechanics? Not violate, but it transcends the laws of quantum mechanics. This very remarkable discovery made Chandrasekhar react in the following way. In my entire scientific life, the most shattering experience has been the realization that an exact solution of Einstein's equation, the Kerr metric, provides the absolutely exact representation of untold numbers of massive black holes that populate the universe. In 1972, a young student in Princeton by name Bekenstein argued that black holes must have enormous entropy. Remember in thermodynamics, entropy is a loss of information. It is a measure of loss of information. Since black holes are characterized only by their mass and angular momentum, you don't know what went into it. There is enormous loss of information. So Bekenstein argued that black holes must have entropy. And he argued that this entropy must be proportional to the surface area. The entropy is surface area 4 pi r squared of the black hole multiplied by Boltzmann's constant and the velocity of light in the numerator, Newton's constant of gravity, and Planck's constant in the denominator. Most mysterious. On the left-hand side, you have classical thermodynamics. On the right-hand side, you have classical gravity. And when you try to marry classical gravity with classical thermodynamics, Planck's constant comes up. Remember in 1900, Max Planck tried to unify black body radiation with classical thermodynamics. He could do that only by introducing the Planck's constant, and that was the birth of quantum physics. So here too, one is perhaps witnessing the birth of some new quantum ideas. Black holes have enormous entropy. If you have a 10 solar mass star that collapses to a black hole, its entropy will be 10 to the power 79. There are 100 million black holes in our own galaxy, and there are 2 trillion galaxies in our universe. Therefore, most of the entropy of our universe is locked up in black holes. Hawking said, no, this cannot be. He said, you look in any thermodynamics book, an object cannot have entropy unless it is at a finite temperature. Go and look in your book in thermodynamics. Now, according to classical physics, a black hole absorbs everything. Nothing can come out of it. Therefore, a black hole is a perfect sink. Now look in your thermodynamics books, Sears and Zemansky or whatever. The only perfect sink an object which only absorbs and emits nothing has to be at the absolute zero of temperature. If an object is at a finite temperature, it will both emit and absorb. Therefore, the only object which will only absorb and not emit anything is at absolute zero of temperature. Therefore, Hawking argued that the temperature of a black hole must be 0 degrees, and therefore it cannot have entropy. And yet, 2 years later, he had made one of the most remarkable discoveries of the last century. He showed that a non-rotating black hole will radiate. What kind of a radiation? It will emit particles and radiation just as an ordinary hot body, just as the sun does, just as the earth does, just as you and me radiate, just as the hot plate in your mother's kitchen. A black hole emits radiation like an ordinary hot body. The important thing to appreciate that this radiation is not coming from a rotating black hole where you're extracting the energy from rotation. We are talking of radiation from even a non-rotating black hole. Where is this energy coming from? The only thing that the black hole has is a mass. Therefore, as the black hole radiates, its mass must decrease. And therefore, it will become less massive as it radiates. Just as a body, as it radiates, becomes cooler and cooler and cooler. Similarly, a black hole, as it emits particles and radiation, will become less massive, and less massive. Hawking derived the temperature of a black hole to be inversely proportional to the mass of the black hole. On the right-hand side, the mass of the black hole is in the denominator. Therefore, as the black hole radiates and as its mass becomes smaller, its temperature will increase and not decrease. Therefore, it will radiate more. And therefore, its mass will become even less. Therefore, it will become even hotter. Therefore, it will radiate even more. Till finally, the black hole will sort of explode and evaporate away. And what it will leave behind is the space-time singularity, which was till then hidden by the event horizon. Now we have a terrible state of affairs. We have a naked singularity. We don't know how to deal with it. So has quantum mechanics transcended the cosmic censorship principle? Because if quantum mechanics says a black hole will evaporate away, what remains is the singularity that was formed in the collapse of the star. A naked singularity is a very serious thing because it introduces into physics an element of uncertainty over and above Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Heisenberg said you cannot measure both the position and velocity of a particle with arbitrary precision. Fine. But now the matter is much worse because particles and radiation emitted from a black hole come from a region of volume about which we know very little. We not only cannot say what will be the velocity and position of the particle in respecting Heisenberg's principle, we cannot even give a proper description of it except a probabilistic description. As Hawking said, Einstein was doubly wrong. In his arguments with Niels Bohr in the early days of quantum mechanics, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Einstein said, God does not play dice. Hawking said, God not only plays dice, he throws them in places where you cannot see. The singularity theorem of Roger Penrose of 1964 made Hawking, a young student in Cambridge at the time, think of the following. Black holes form when gravity gets extremely strong. The discovery of cosmic microwave background radiation in 1963 tells us that 13 billion years ago, the universe was very small, very dense, and very hot. Therefore, gravity in the early universe must have been extremely strong. This idea that the conditions of the early universe are very similar to a collapsing star resulted in Hawking and Penrose collaborating and publishing one of the most important results of the last century. They showed that if Einstein's general theory of relativity is the correct description of gravity and the universe, then the universe could have begun from a singularity, from a point, could end in a singularity in a space-time point, or both began as a point and will end as a point. Was there a beginning to our universe? As you know, this question underlies all religions and all philosophies. And yet this question had remained meaningless within the premise of science. The question was meaningless because it was not possible to pose this question in a mathematically rigorous manner within the premise of science. The Penrose-Hawking theorem made this question scientifically meaningful in a mathematically rigorous fashion. Thus began the present revolution in astronomy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your presentation. The topic is open for discussion. I request everyone, if you are ready, do drop
ಕ್ವಶನ್ಸ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾಳೆ ಇಲ್ವಾ? ಶುಡ್ ರೀಡ್ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಯಾವಂತ ರೀಡ್ ದ ಕ್ವಶನ್ಸ್.
Sir, there's a question by Amoga Vasha. Why is it necessary for every galaxy to have a supermassive black hole at its center?
You understand that if I have a collection of stars in a galaxy, then it is reasonable that the density of stars will be more towards the center, because the nature of gravitational potential 1/r is that it is more advantageous. Remember that gravitational potential energy is negative. It is minus gm²/r. Therefore, it is energetically advantageous for the particles to be closer to the dynamical center. Now, if you have a large collection of mass, stars going around, then sooner or later, they could collide, coalesce, and that is how black holes form. The details of how a 4 million solar mass, let alone a billion solar mass black hole formed at the center of the galaxy is not yet entirely clear, but there are interesting ideas. One of the ideas is that, let us ask the following question: why does a star collapse? In other words, why is the star stable? After all, Newton's gravity says the star must contract and contract and contract till it is crushed out of existence. A star is stable because it generates energy, and the pressure of radiation and pressure of the gas pushes gravity out, and that is why a star is stable. Now imagine that there was a gigantic star of 1 million solar masses at the center of the galaxy. When its supply of pressure, which is opposing gravity, runs out, then such a star will collapse and form a black hole, which will be a supermassive body. The other possibility is small black holes coalesce to become larger and larger black holes. And after all, the universe is 14 billion years old. Galaxies are 10 billion years old at least. And there's been a lot of time for small black holes to coalesce and become larger and larger black holes. But let me be very frank and honest. The exact details of how these supermassive black holes form is still a matter of debate.
Thank you, sir. There's next question by Pratik Hegde. Why is the object discovered at the center of our galaxy called a supermassive compact object instead of a black hole? Is there any particular reason not to declare it as a black hole?
That's a very good question. So far, we have only indirect or circumstantial evidence that it is a black hole. And the argument is, as I said before, is if I have a body of a certain mass within a certain size, then it cannot be anything other than a black hole. But that is not proving that it is a black hole. To really prove that it is a black hole, you must study the motion of light particles and elementary particles very close to the surface of the black hole. Now, these stars that are orbiting the center of our galaxy are not very close to the central object. They're very, very far away, where effects of general relativity are unimportant. For example, I told you that a flash of light emitted far away will expand in a spherically symmetric wavefront, but if I am very close to the black hole, the wavefront will be attracted towards the black hole. But in order to see that, I have to go very, very close to the black hole. Now, in order to go very, very close to the black hole, you must have a very high angular resolution in your telescope. We don't have that kind of resolution yet. Secondly, radio astronomers have remarkable angular resolution. Why? Remember that the angular resolution of a telescope or a microscope is equal to the diameter of the lens divided by the wavelength. Okay? Sorry, lambda by d. Wavelength divided by the diameter. Therefore, larger and larger is the diameter, lambda by d is smaller and smaller, I can look more and more accurately inside a very small angular size. Now, radio astronomers can have telescopes all over the earth and combine the signals. So the diameter of the telescope is as big as the diameter of the earth itself. But unfortunately, from the vicinity of a black hole, you will not get radio waves. You will not get visible radiation. You will not get infrared radiation. What you will get will be X-rays. And the reason is the gas around the vicinity, in the vicinity of the black hole, will be very hot. Its temperature will be tens of millions of degrees. Gas at temperature of 10 million degrees or 100 million degrees will emit only X-rays and gamma rays and not visible radiation or radio waves. So it's an impossibly difficult task now. X-ray astronomy has become very sophisticated. We have the Chandra telescope, named after Subrahmanyam Chandrasekhar. It is the greatest X-ray telescope launched so far. But that does not have the angular resolution to be able to see very close to the black hole. But in the next 20, 30, 40 years, in the lifetime of you young students, certainly angular resolution in X-ray astronomy will reach the values that are needed to look very close to the black hole. And when you do that, you can try to verify the predictions of the general theory of relativity in the vicinity of the black hole. Then and then only you can say, I have proved that this object is a black hole. Till then, it is circumstantial. I hope I have answered your question.
Thank you, sir. So there's a question by Asha Raj. Can a black hole swallow another black hole, or do they instead just combine to form an even massive one?
What was the first part? Will a black hole fall into... Yes, if two... Let me answer the question in the following way. Two black holes can coalesce. And when they coalesce, their mass will become m1 plus m2. And therefore, its size will also be larger, because the radius of the black hole will be 2gm by c squared. Now m will be m1 plus m2. So two black holes can coalesce. And one of the important results that Stephen Hawking proved is that the black hole cannot split into two. You know that nuclei can split into two. That is the phenomenon of fission. Black holes cannot split into two. Why? Remember the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics tells you that the entropy of a body can only increase. It can never decrease. And since black holes have entropy, you can only have a situation where two black holes coalesce and become larger and entropy becomes even larger, and not splitting the black hole into two, thereby decreasing the entropy. Okay, that's one of the remarkable theorems that Hawking proved. So the answer to your question is black holes can merge, coalesce, and become even more massive black holes.
Thank you, sir. Sir, there's a question by Nikhileshwar. 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. I can understand it with an example of chocolates. 0 is equal to 0 into 3. How do I visualize this? Is there any universal definition to time, as ticking clock is just a mechanism?
No, the universal definition of time, see, time and frequency are related, right? Frequency of a wave is the number of times, number of crests or troughs that pass through you in 1 second, right? Fine. So the standard of time is defined by a particular wavelength or frequency emitted by a cesium atom. It is accurate to 1 part in 10 to the power 17. So the frequency of time is the frequency of this particular line emitted by cesium atom. And that is the standard. Okay. So what we are saying is that if you have a cesium atom in the GPS receiver, the frequency that we will measure will be different. And if there is a cesium atom at the bottom of Kolar goldfields, 2 kilometers down, that frequency will be different because of gravitational effects. But the standard of time is set by the frequency of a particular line emitted by cesium atom. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, sir. There's another question. If I write my name in the third page of a book, can I say I have formatted a part of space? Because by moving the book, my name also moves with it.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you please repeat it?
Yes, sir. If I write my name in the third page of a book, can I say I have formatted a part of space? Because by moving the book, my name also moves with it.
Well, this is a very tricky question to answer. We thought over centuries that space was an empty region in which you put tables and chairs and books and people in a classroom, right? But all that changed in 1916 when Einstein published his general theory of relativity. According to general theory of relativity, space and time have no meaning in the absence of matter. You understand? Till 1916, philosophers had always argued through centuries, particularly the European philosophers, as whether space was something absolute. Space, you can have empty space. It says in the Bible, God created the heaven and the earth. So what was there before he created the heaven and the earth? One would say there was empty space. But you're not allowed to say that anymore. Because according to general theory of relativity, space and time have no meaning in the absence of matter itself. So given that definition of space, I don't know if you move your book, you can say whether space moves with it or not. I'm not able to answer that question in any meaningful way. So perhaps we should, it's a bit philosophical. So can we move on to the next question, please?
Yes, sir. Are dimensions independent of matter and time?
We don't know the answer to this question as yet. We don't know the answer to this question because Einstein's statement that space and time are related to the existence of matter itself refers to four-dimensional space-time. But nowadays, people are talking about space which has 27 dimensions. The other dimensions are looped in so that in our world, we don't experience those dimensions. But the theory of gravity within the premise of quantum theory has not yet been formulated. Therefore, since these other dimensions are being postulated by quantum theories, since general relativity is a classical theory of gravity, I don't know how to answer this question as yet. Okay? I don't think anybody else knows the answer as yet.
Thank you, sir.
So the first
So
question,
there's
1
a
plus 1.
question by Vaibhav Kini. He had read that the radiation temperature is inversely proportional to the black hole's mass. So, smaller black holes should be able to emit larger amount of radiation than more massive black holes and should thus shrink and dissipate faster. Can this be true?
So that's a very interesting question. If you can recall the slide that I showed for the temperature of the black hole, the temperature of the black hole was, if you let's imagine that you have a black hole whose mass is 1 solar mass. Let's imagine the sun becomes a black hole. Its temperature will be 10 to the power minus 6 Kelvin. 10 to the power minus 6 Kelvin. Now, the temperature of our universe, even in empty regions, is 3 degrees Kelvin. 3 degrees Kelvin is hotter than 10 to the power minus 6 Kelvin. Therefore, that black hole will only absorb and not emit much. You understand? So you need black holes whose temperature is much greater than the temperature of the universe, for which you must have very, very small mass black holes. Suppose you had a black hole whose mass is just the mass of Mount Everest. Then its size will be just the size of a proton. And its temperature will be about 10 to the power 10 Kelvin. Then such a black hole will emit more than it will absorb. And as it emits, it will become hotter, emit more, hotter, emit more, till finally it will explode. Now, it's not easy to form a black hole whose mass is the mass of Mount Everest. We don't know how to do it. Nature today can only make black holes from stars. The mass of the sun is 10 to the power 33 grams. The mass of Mount Everest is only 10 to the power 15 grams. But Hawking speculated that when the universe was only about a fraction of a second old, a millisecond old, you could have formed black holes whose sizes were the size of protons, whose masses were those of Mount Everest. Now, those black holes will now be exploding. So Hawking conjectured that there could be flashes of gamma rays and X-rays in our universe today, which are the result of the final stages of the evaporation of extremely small mass black holes, which were formed when the universe was very, very small. Radio astronomers and X-ray and gamma ray astronomers have been looking for such flashes ever since Hawking wrote this paper in 1974. So far, there is no convincing evidence for it. Although Sir Roger Penrose thinks that there is a strong evidence for these exploding Hawking black holes.
Thank you, sir. There's a question by Akash. Does a naked singularity swallow up mass? If so, wouldn't it create another black hole because the mass becomes radiation?
I think it is not correct to say that a naked singularity will swallow mass, because naked singularity, we don't know how to describe it. And that is the reason why we don't like singularities. So we don't know what are the properties of naked space-time singularity. So I think it is not correct to say that it can swallow anything. All we can say is, if there is a naked singularity, because we don't know what went into it, it produces an enormous amount of uncertainty in the world. We don't know what went in. So I cannot answer what the singularity will do. Okay. Now, people have conjectured, of course. According to one of the conjectures, if you fall into the singularity, you could come out in another universe. These are called wormholes. Okay, worms go through one hole and come out through the other side in another hole. So, according to some speculation, if you fall into a singularity, you could emerge into another universe. As some of you may know, we thought till now there is only one universe. It is spelled with, it is actually the universe, capital T and capital U. Nowadays, people believe that there could be many universes, and our universe is only one of them. So if you fall into a singularity, according to some people, including Hawking himself, that you could emerge into some other universe. But these are speculations, and I don't think we should pursue them too seriously.
Sir, Nikhileshwar wants to speak. So he had asked few questions and he wants to have some more clarification. Nikhileshwar, you can unmute and then talk.
Hello, sir. My first question was that I can understand why is 1 plus 1 equals 2 with an example of chocolates, but how do I visualize 0 equals 0 times 3? Means, how do I understand taking a number which is well defined from a number which is 0? Can I associate this example to a real life example?
I don't understand why you're asking this question. Mathematics says 0 times anything is 0. What has that got to do with the subject of my lecture today?
Because in when mass is, when we try to study the mass inside a black hole, we kind of say it is more or less same. The matter around the black hole or matter inside a black hole is same, but we do also understand that there's no difference. Means if I could take out something, then there must be something that goes in. Means the same example which 15 kgs 15 units came out of 10 units, and
It did not come out of inside the black hole. It went near the black hole into the ergosphere and came out. And I'm extracting energy. What is the difficulty in that? Imagine a ceiling fan and I throw ping pong balls at the ceiling fan. Even though I throw the ping pong ball very slowly towards the ceiling fan, the ping pong ball will be thrown away by the blade of the ceiling fan and move with very high speed. Where did it get its energy from? It got the energy from the rotational energy of the ceiling fan. So when I said that Penrose said you can extract energy from a rotating black hole, it is not by going into the black hole and coming out. You didn't go into the fan. You just went to the vicinity where the blade of the fan is turning around. So you just went into the ergosphere and came out. Understand? So don't bring in mathematical analogy of 0 into 3 is 0. That has nothing to do with what we are talking about. That has nothing to do with black holes. Black holes are real objects because they exert gravitational field. Therefore, they are real.
Okay, sir, I got it.
So further we'll proceed. There's a question by Manoj. Difference between black hole and white hole and wormhole.
See, black hole is a region of space into which you can fall but cannot come out. Now, all the laws of physics that we know, except the second law of thermodynamics, you can change T to minus T. In Newton's law, F equal to ma, you can change T to minus T and the equations are still valid. So if you believe in that idea, then you could have situations which is the mirror image of a black hole. Things come out of it, and that is called as a white hole. So if you I'm not sure I want to pursue this because these are all very speculative things. So if you have a black hole which is evaporating, like Hawking suggested, then you could say it is like a white hole because things are coming out of it. You understand? Let's leave that. These are all very speculative.
Thank you, sir. There's a question by Ms. Sharma.
Yavanika, 1 second. There
Yes,
are many questions. What we'll do, we will arrange the answers from sir through mail now because it's a very long duration now. So I think we can stop now.
Okay, ma'am.
Excuse me, sir. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
My question was there in a row. It is very captivating about the black holes. I had read the Stephen Hawking's brief answers to big questions, and the way you explained time ticking in Mount Fuji, it was very captivating. I actually want to know more about time. Like, how does it stop there in black hole?
You will
And
have to
if
speak a little louder because there's a construction going on outside my window and I can't hear you properly.
my question was, if the universe is constantly expanding, how an object comes and fall into the black hole? Is the gravitational pull of the black hole is so strong that it attracts the mass or object surrounding it?
No. It's not like that. Suppose tomorrow when you wake up, the sun has become a black hole. Okay? Nothing will change. Nothing will change. We'll still go around once in 365 days. Only thing is the sun will not radiate anymore, and soon we will all die. All life on Earth will disappear gradually. But as far as our motion is concerned, nothing will happen. We won't be swallowed by the sun. It's only if you go very close to it. But please remember, the way when you are far away from a black hole, you can regard that black hole as a mass m, which is attracting us by Newton's law of gravity. You will not be wrong by very much. You will be wrong only by 1 part in a million or so. But if you go very, very close to the black hole, then you cannot use Newton's laws. You will have to use Einstein's laws. That is the general theory of relativity. It is a law of gravity. It will tell you exactly how the black hole will attract you as a function of distance and as a function of time. So that's what the general theory of relativity is. It is a modification of Newton's law of gravity in the regime where gravity is extremely strong. Even a planet like Mercury is so far away from the sun that the effect of general relativity is only 1 part in a million or 1 part in 10 million. It's not very important at all. You understand? So if you fall into the black hole, it's only because you have gone very close to the black hole. But then if you go very close to the sun, you will fall into it unless you go around. So the only way you will not fall into the sun is by going around the sun so that the centrifugal force is equal to the force of gravity and you will be in an orbit around the sun. You can do the same thing with a black hole too. You can go around the black hole and be very stable. But you will then reach a critical distance. If you reach that distance, which is about 3 times the gravitational radius, then you will fall into the black hole. So till you reach a distance 3 times the gravitational radius, you need not worry about falling into the black hole. Okay? So if you take, for example, the galactic center black hole, it is 4 million times the mass of the sun. So it is about 10 million kilometers in radius. So till you go to a distance of 30 million kilometers, nothing will happen to you. 30 million kilometers is a very, very short distance. You know how far we are from the sun? We are 150 million kilometers from the sun. So if the sun were to become a black hole, its size will be 3 kilometers. So till you go to 10 kilometers, nothing will Nothing dramatic is going to happen. Okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. And next question I have was about the time. The way you dictated about it, the Mount Fuji, and when we are on the ground, it was quite captivating to know that. How does it work on black hole that the time and space, that there is no time and space in black hole?
I didn't say there's no space. I said time is stretched so that there is no ticking of the clock anymore. By that I mean the frequency of radiation, which defines the standard of your time, will be zero. Wavelength will be infinity. Okay? So time does
Okay,
not
sir.
flow.
Okay.
Time does not flow on the surface of the black hole. Nothing. That is another way of saying is that you cannot detect any changes in the surface. You understand?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yavanika,
It's an honor.
Yes,
hello,
ma'am.
Yavanika.
Yes,
Hello,
ma'am.
Yavanika. We can wind up now. Yeah,
Yes.
other questions will be answered by mail. Okay.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful presentation. As we have come
Just
to the
one
end of,
minute. There's some truck going. I can't hear you. So yes, please repeat.
sir, I said thank you for this wonderful presentation, sir. As we have come to the end of the lecture series, now I would like to call upon Kavyashri Yadav from 7th semester to give a small word.
Thank you, Yavanika. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kavyashri N of 7th semester molecular biology. The best and beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt by heart. Thank you is one such among them. I consider it a great privilege to propose a vote of thanks to all the dignitaries who have witnessed it as a memorable and successful event. Words are not enough to express the gratitude. On behalf of Science Forum, faculty members, and students of Yuvarajas College, I would like to thank Dr. Shashank Tripathi, ISC Bengaluru, Professor P.G. Chandrasekhar, CCMB Hyderabad, and Professor G. Srinivasan, Raman Research Institute, Bengaluru, who graced us with their knowledge and understanding. I would like to thank our beloved Dr. N.S. Devaki, convener Science Forum, for helping us motivated to organize such events. Heartfelt thanks to Dr. Yashoda B.N., Principal Yuvarajas College, Dr. H.C. Devraje Gowda, Administrative Officer, Dr. H.B. Mahesha, Controller of Examination, Dr. R. Vidya, Coordinator, faculty and members of Science Forum, Yuvarajas College, Mysore. And I also thank all the teachers of various other colleges for joining us in this event. An event of this dimension cannot happen overnight. The wheels start rolling weeks in advance. We have been fortunate enough to be backed by a team of very motivated and dedicated students, committee, and volunteers. Lastly, I thank all my fellow mates for showing their interest in this program and making it a successful one.